Thank you everyone for joining our content car wash webinar. This is something where we've had a lot of clients, and especially for whatever reason, this year in 2025, so many of you have asked for a webinar and some more information about how do you go through the content car wash process. So we thought this is a great time to have this webinar and really walk everyone through the basics here. So really what we hope to achieve with this is kind of really demonstrate the simplicity and efficiency that this process entails. One of the things, we're going to talk a little bit more about this at the end of the webinar, but where we presented the process that we went through with Ratio a couple years ago, it didn't take a long time, relatively speaking. It only took us about 400 what a slip there, 40 hours to clean all of Ratio's library. And we're going to go over those numbers at the end of this presentation. So to kind of give you a point of perspective, how quick and efficient this process can be. So ultimately, the reason why you would want to do this ensures your content library lines perfectly with your graphical Revit standards. Thus, that means your project deliverables are in alignment with those same standards. So it's really what it comes down to. It is a quality issue that we're trying to address with this content cleanup process. Additionally, by going through this process, the things that you're teaching Guardian as you clean things up is thus adopted by every future project. And then as more content comes into those projects, Guardian immediately knows what to do with those properties and will align them automatically with your standards. And so this is sort of, you have those immediate results of improving the quality of your content, but then you have that long term where you're on a day-to-day basis improving the quality of your project deliverables. This is something that really rings true with a lot of your technical leadership. We probably all heard it. I know I feel like I say this on a daily basis, that Revit can't produce good-looking drawings. Revit can produce as good-looking drawings as anything before it. The problem is we've never been able to control the graphical output because our Revit properties are a mess. And every time we load a piece of content, it gets further and further out of line. Guardian really stems that issue by making those automatic alignments. All right, so let's go ahead and start diving into the webinar. So a couple things to kind of go over, some ground rules before we get started here. The mics are live, so at any moment you can unmute yourself, but we ask that you raise your hand before doing so. We do want to make this sort of more interactive. In addition, as many of you have already done, feel free to utilize the chat. So the Guardian team is here to answer any questions that you may have. So feel free utilizing the chat. Also, I will ask for one more thing. Use reactions. Me standing here, I just see a blank screen, or I guess I see my PowerPoint there. But having the reactions, the thumbs up, even a thumbs down is kind of keeps me going. So feel free to use those. All right. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive right in. All right. The content car wash. Now, this may seem a little overwhelming at first, but we're going to kind of break this down. So a couple things to note here before we get too into the weeds is throughout this presentation, we're really going to have two types of slides. One is steps that are foundational, things that you kind of have to do to kind of build this process. And these are represented by a little brick icon, as you can see them along the top. So all the foundational steps as part of this process are listed along the top. The second of this is the actual cleaning process. This is where you're going to be using Guardian's project properties to actually clean the content as you go along. And this is just represented by an actual car wash icon. So let's start talking about the individual steps. Again, we're going to keep this high level at this moment in time. Then we're going to dive into each step with more detail. So first, define your graphical standards. So we're going to get into details of what I mean by define your graphical standards here in the subsequent slides. But really, this is just your basic your textiles, your line styles, your line patterns, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we're going through this entire process, and just something to keep in mind when you're using Guardian's project properties, the model that you're working in is your source of truth. So all of your properties need to be loaded into that given model for Guardian to map what's incoming to what's in your project. So this step of defining your graphical standards is really vital to this. All right, step 2 is clean your Revit template. So our recommendation is these graphical standards are put into your Revit template, the one that you share with all your projects. So before you kind of get to republishing that template to everyone, you're going to go and clean it using Guardian's project properties. The next step is creating a family cleanup tool. And this is just going to be your own Revit template that you're going to use to start this process of cleaning your content. And we're going to show how this will actually work as we progress. Then once you have that established, step 4 here is the process of cleaning your families. Just taking those families and dropping into that content cleanup that content cleanup tool. Then we get into step 5 is the create a content container. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, yes, I have content containers. I like using content containers. I've heard people say, I'm not a big fan of them. I would recommend as part of your cleaning process and your long-term of maintaining content, your content container is really the only way you can really effectively understand your standards writ large. And as part of this process, you're going to learn about your standards. And you're not going to be able to see this on a family by family basis, or sometimes even by, say, a batch of families. And moving on to step 6 is exporting your content. You know, you want to get this content out for your teams to use, publishing it to your content management solution, such as Content Catalog, Avel, or even just a folder somewhere on your system. All right, let's go ahead and sort of dive into step number 1, define your graphical standards. So my recommendation is for you to create what I call your standards dashboards right within your project template. So this does multiple things here. Is first and foremost, it gets all of your standards into your template. So again, as I mentioned earlier, your project template is your source of truth for your content, or excuse me, for your standards. And so as content comes in, you need to be able to have those in there to map. Second of all, as you are introducing all this clean content, saying, hey, everything's aligned to our standards, people are going to ask, what are our standards? This is a great way of getting and communicating out your standards to every project team. It's right there within your Revit template. The other thing is I would recommend doing this as a legend. The reason being is by putting in a legend, no one remembers or thinks about looking for content in a legend. And so it really helps preventing these standards from being deleted and purged out of your models. So let's actually talk about the actual standards. So the first ones, let's talk about the necessary ones, your line patterns, your line styles, your textiles, your dimension styles. Now, many of you may have a good understanding of what these are, others may not. So focusing on like line patterns and line styles, I would recommend starting with National CAD standards. Just go get a version of National CAD standards. And as I mentioned earlier, working with your technical leadership is saying to your technical leadership, hey, we've done all this work to make sure every last template, every last family meets these given standards. The next here is object styles. And more specifically, since object styles are actually kind of static in Revit, it's your subcategories that could vary. Now, a lot of people really don't understand subcategories and how they work. You may not even know, enough about the subcategories to actually define a standard. So something I came across many years ago was the Australia and New Zealand BIM standards. That was a whole list of object styles that they required. And I found that even though they were on the other side of the globe, that what they published as standards really worked well for me to establish our subcategory standards for our given firm. Now, unfortunately, now the Australia and New Zealand Revit standards is kind of went to the wayside, but luckily, reaching out to our friends at bimcontent.com, they actually have basically adopted these for their own internal guidelines in which they create all the content that they provide to all their customers. So they've made that document available. And so I would say this is a great starting point to start understanding a standard for subcategories. You may use it, you may not, but at least it gives you good understanding, sort of the necessary subcategories that is required for a robust content system. All right, the next is we kind of get into the nice to haves. Your fill patterns, filled regions. I would say most of your architects really care a lot about your filled patterns and filled regions. Definitely, it at first pass, I would go and make sure these are all set. But if you have limited time, these are things you could put on, that second round. Also getting into materials, shared parameters, and even your system families. So now textiles, dimension styles, technically are system families, but you can even get into, say, wall styles or viewports or view types. There's a lot of system families that you can utilize Guardian to clean up. And I also want to come back to shared parameters. There's a lot of ways in which Guardian is really effective at managing your shared parameters. And many of you may be starting to think about, how do I start utilizing Autodesk's shared parameter service? And when you have content that's all over the place, it becomes difficult to understand what is the good, the bad of your shared parameters. So this provides you a great opportunity this process to get your shared parameters in alignment. And then lastly here, sort of in the future, your view templates, your view filters, your load classifications. This isn't really necessary for round one when it comes to Revit families themselves, because these are more these are more sort of view-based or model-based settings. Now, if part of this process you want to clean up your detail items, this is something you may want to have in place. So with that being said, a couple of things you may be thinking, well, what if as I go through this, what if I don't know what all the things coming in are? And we're going to kind of go through some of this. We're going to switch over to live in the model so we can see some of this. Is sometimes just having a placeholder when you have no standards, right? As you start figuring them out. So when I initially did this years ago, if I saw something that I'm like, is this a standard? Is it not a standard? Do I want it to be? I just prefix it with a TBD. And then once I got it all out in front of me and knew what we had, I would go back and figure out, do I want this to be included, or do I want to change this to an existing standard that we have? So as you go through this process, you're going to learn along the way of what your standards are. You're not going to learn it on that initial family. It's going to take the whole process and kind of seeing it globally. This kind of comes back to the idea of the content container, where you can see all of that. And lastly, you want all this, all these properties to send it to Guardian Sync, where these properties are in the cloud. Now you can distribute them out to all your given projects. All right, so I've kind of felt like I've really rambled on for quite a bit. So I actually want to switch over here to Revit and kind of show you live how we've kind of set things up and starting that initial process. So I'm going to do all this live. I know we're not supposed to do modeling things live because it seems like it always goes wrong. So, but I'm going to roll the dice here. So I'm going to assume that what you see here is our project template. I'm going to go ahead and just create a new model straight from here. So now that we have this, I'm going to actually come back over here and show the dashboards that we've created in here that lays out our line styles, our text styles, our dimension styles, even laying out our filled regions, and also our annotation tags and symbols. So a lot of these can be hosted in the cloud with Guardian Sync. Some others, as far as your tags or your symbols, may not. But if you have this ahead of time, this becomes really helpful, and especially if you're getting into cleaning up your details. Now, simple things as some say revision tags, those things tend to come in, and this gives you an opportunity to teach Guardian your your simple best or your simple standards when it comes to your tags. All right. So now that we have our standards defined, as I mentioned, as far as step 2, we want to clean our template. So I'm actually coming over here to project properties. And this is where you would want to kind of go through each of these tabs and start mapping an old standard to a new standard, or a foreign standard to a new standard. So for those who have not utilized Guardian here, I'm actually going to undo this here. I'm going to say don't remember. And I'm going to go and remap this. And I can go ahead and map this to ball. This actually was not a good example here. Actually wanted to do this one down here. Well, we're going to do this one. Pretend that didn't happen. So this time, I'm going to map this to, say, our glass standard and hit OK. As you can see, Guardian has already memorized these. I went through ahead of time, and out of sake of time, went through and pre-mapped a lot of these. So we can just go ahead and process this. And so you'd go through tab by tab. Here's where you find a lot of your tags. And here you'd find a lot of your annotation. So your text styles and your dimension styles and whatnot. You can see here, for demonstration purpose, we listed our old standard. But because now all of our new standards, which we prefixed with GDN here, are in here, we can start mapping these. So the process, as I demonstrated earlier, is just a matter of going from clicking that old standard, that foreign standard, and mapping it to your standard. And I'm actually going to review this live, or actually process this live. Now, I think this is a good opportunity as this scans and cleans this given model. If there are any questions up to this point, we'll take a quick little pause here. Or if there's any questions in the chat.
Hey, Chris, it's Joe. I've got one for you.
Oh, Joe Wages. Uh-oh. Gotta be on my A game here.
Okay, so what happens if you've got multiple like you say you're doing MEP families and you've got multiple types for power, multiple types for horsepower, multiple types for you've got redundant types. How can you do it where you default to whatever the system ones are? Is there a way to do that?
There is. I would say once you've established sort of that mapping and you know what the default one is, because when you think about it, is when you build your template, you're going to know what that default one is, right? So whomever is responsible for managing those types initially, who's built all of them, would know. And then as you kind of go through this process, is making sure that you're always mapping to that system one. I hope that answers your question. I would say
it does.
Yeah, if Parley has anything to add to that, he can add it in the chat. So as you can see, we have 241 changes here, and doing this live, we're going through this pretty quickly. Now, also note, going through each of these lines would take a significant, I want to say a significant amount of time, a notable amount of time. I would say it took me about, in preparation of this, going one by one and clicking the mapping of these 241 changes took me about 45 minutes. So when you think about it, it's all in. You can do a lot of this in a very short amount of time. All right, AJ, I see that you have raised your hand. You have a question?
More of just a comment in terms of if people are trying to do this cleanup aspect and how much scrubbing of the content needs to happen, that potentially doing it in smaller chunks and not going through it and mapping absolutely everything, as we've run into some issues of running our mappings through a pre-existing old project, and there's just so much it's trying to grab that it has, sometimes we've run into troubles of getting into the high numbers like what you're showing, but it all depends on the content itself. So
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we're gonna hit on a little bit of this in a bit. Thank you, AJ, where understanding, like start small with this, and understand just the quantity of the content that you process at any given time. As you're aware, is Guardian utilizes Revit, and with more and more processing it takes, those are just resources that are being consumed, that Revit is processing. So yeah, it's always good to start with small chunks. And you start to, when you get through this process, you start to learn what is the appropriate amount. And it really depends on several factors, is not just quantity of content, but the complexity of content. And so say something like a door family that may have multiple nested families in them, that'll take longer than just say a simple annotation tag. So these are the things that you kind of learn as you go. Thank you, AJ. So as we just demonstrated, step 2 is cleaning your Revit template. Now, a couple of things I would recommend here is you want to make sure that you establish the proper or have your proper mapping configuration file assigned to this. I would also recommend you have that as sort of your master that you use as part of the cleaning process. And it's not the same that you will assign to all your subsequent projects. I would always, once I went through that process, I would just duplicate that mapping configuration, and that duplicate is what would be assigned to all the active projects. I just want to make sure that me or my team who is responsible for going through the cleaning process had absolute control and knew everything that was happening within that mapping configuration. All right, moving on to step 3 is creating a family cleanup tool. Again, this is sort of a foundational step in all this. And what we recommend is actually taking your project template and kind of stripping it down by removing all your project specific views and sheets. And really the point of this is not only a starting point and a cleaning tool, but it also gives you the opportunity to review the sort of the graphical aspects of your content. So as you can see here, and I'll demonstrate this live in the model, is that we've established a sheet that has your plan view, your RCP, your elevation, your section, your 3D, and have all these views in your fine, medium, and coarse detail level. So you can get a good understanding of how this piece of content will be represented in all this different views. So let's go ahead and flip back over here to the model now that we've cleaned it. And if we come up here to our sheets and we go to our 3D family, we can see the same thing that we saw here. So we have these 13 views. So for our plan, elevation, section, RCP, we've got each of these set. So now you can obviously here with the piece of casework that we're showing, you're not going to see it, RCP. And that's sort of the goal, right? Just make sure it is things showing up appropriately. So this is a good way, especially when you're getting started, to understand how things are showing up. And coming back to your object styles, right, is making sure that is the subcategory that I have assigned, is it showing up appropriately? Is the overrides I may have with the view template that, is that showing up appropriately? So this gives you a good insight of how everything is performing within your given families, especially as you go through and do all the mappings. All right. We've talked about a lot of the foundational aspects of all this. Let's come back over to the PowerPoint. Step 4, actually cleaning your content. So now that you've had your content container established, you're going to simply just take your families and start dropping them in there. Now, I would recommend is starting with certain categories, and within certain categories, focusing on a few base families. So what I mean by that is here we've got a piece of casework. Is basically if if you've ever gone through the process of creating large quantities of content, you basically focus on creating a handful of base families that hopefully address all the subsequent families. So whatever those are, I would say start there. And you just simply drop them into your model. And I'm actually going to do this live here in a minute, is because once you drop those in, you're going to have Guardian's dialog, which we're going to demonstrate, to start mapping these. Probably about 90% of the mappings that you need to perform will be found within that first set of base content. And so this speeds up the process for all the subsequent pieces of content. The other thing I want to talk about when it comes to your base content is, say, doors. So a lot of firms build their doors where you have nested shared families. And so my recommendation is make sure that, especially if you're using shared families, is those nested shared families are preloaded. That's the first thing that you would do. You would load them into the model, and then do all the mappings as needed. Then when you start loading the actual host family, or in this case the doors, Revit will provide you the prompt. Do you want to overwrite, or do you want to use the ones in the project? In that case, you would just simply select the one that's in the project and just do that, because those are the ones that are your source of truth. And then, as AJ had mentioned earlier, is understanding what is the appropriate amount of families to do at a given time. So my recommendation is to do somewhere between 50 to 100 families at a time. And you may be thinking, well, I've got 4,000 families. That's going to take forever. It actually goes much quicker than you think, right? Once you start going, you start picking up speed, because you're doing these mappings as you go along. And as I mentioned earlier, is about 90% of the mappings are going to be performed probably within the first handful of families. And so at that point, your time is not really doing much other than Guardian and Revit processing those incoming pieces of content. So another thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, is you may not understand all the given properties that are coming in at that given time. Don't worry about it. Don't sweat it. If you don't understand what it is, what it's doing, simply rename it in Guardian to put TBD. So then once you're done with all this and all this content is in your model or in your content container, that's when you can go back and start to investigate a little bit more. Don't get too hung up as part of the process investigating every little standard. Just wait to the end, just punt on them. It's better to see them collectively at the end. All right, so with that being said, let's go back over here to Revit. And so what I'm going to do is come over here to my floor plan view, and let's get my folder open here. And I'm just going to take a door, and I'm going to drop it in. Now that I've placed the door, I'm just going to escape, and Guardian is going to go ahead and start processing this family. So I purposely utilized the door here, as I mentioned earlier, that doors are typically heavier. Reason being, or the reason I wanted to show this is, you can see it actually goes pretty quick on a single door. And as you do more and more doors, you're going to be processing a lot more at a time. So now when you have your incoming content, as you can see, the way this happens is a little differently than when you're processing your project template. Before you went to project properties and went through your mappings. In this case, you're presented with this dialog. So a couple of things that we can note here is that here we have this nested family. So one of the things that I like to do here is, when I rename these, is when I did nested families, I like to rename them with the nested up front. So all the shared nested families kind of group themselves within the project browser. Another thing you have to note when you are doing families, it's just not about mapping or renaming the family, but you also have to map or rename the family type. So this is a good example when it comes to the nested shared. Had I preloaded the door panel itself, I could have mapped this to the door panel that's in the project. So I'm just going to go through and kind of rename this to F and flush panel. And that's really all you really need to do is kind of go through this process and start going through and seeing where things are used, how it's being used, whether these are duplicates. We can see here that these two are exactly the same. So now what I can do is I can go ahead and select this and map it to that. Now, the beauty of this and beauty of the Guardian and the mapping configurations is as soon as we teach Guardian what this is, whenever it sees it in the future, is automatically going to do it for you. So coming down here, let's get into like the diagonals. Now, because, excuse me, the arrowheads, because the diagonal 64th is not being used in this model or in this family, you really think about it, like how often do you really need an arrowhead in a door family? Is Guardian is like, we're just going to purge it out automatically for you. So any property that is not used, Guardian by default will set that to be purged out. Let's come down here to our shared parameters. You can see here we've got the not the correct shared parameter frame type. So how many times have you been on a project where you go to your door schedule and your frame type and your panel type is not being scheduled? Well, because the family coming in has the incorrect shared parameter. And so here we can simply just go ahead and select this. And if I type in scheduled frame type, we can go ahead and map that. We can go through here and select scheduled panel type, map it. And simple things here, like here is a good example. Here's our old, we're going to get to our materials, our old standard clearance zone. We want that to be our new one. And I'm going to put it to be our Guardian default. And that's all you really do is kind of go down this process and start mapping this. Even here, we have this do not use glass. Maybe, while this might not be used at this moment in time, this might be an opportunity for me to go ahead and teach Guardian, whenever you see do not use this glass, I want it to be the specific glass that we use throughout our projects. So I type in glass, and maybe I just want the clear glass. And so in the future, every time Guardian sees do not use this glass, it'll update it to the Guardian clear glass. So this is a matter, again, continuing here, just teaching Guardian the correct mappings. And you just continue going on and on and on. Now, another thing I'd like to highlight here is sometimes in a given family, you may find, and especially when you're starting off early on here, you'll find that you have a lot of content or properties in here that may not meet your naming conventions or are misspelled. This also provides a good opportunity to go through and just go ahead and rename these if you need to. So if I go ahead and select this and rename it, I know the underscore material is not our standard, gives me the opportunity to go ahead and teach Guardian. This is a great opportunity. And all this is really the goal is to be teaching Guardian as much as you can. And so we can just continue down here. We can find our object styles. So we can see here, clearance zone is not being used, but clearance is, but neither one of those are standards. Our standard is clearance zone. This is something you'll find over and over as you go through your content, is people have made up all kinds of different ways to really mean the same thing. The goal here is to get it to a singular, consistent way of doing it. And we can just continue down going through our clearances. And lastly here, we can come in here. And again, let's teach, this is an opportunity to teach Guardian what is the right standards or the correct standards. Now that I have all my mappings, one of the things I want to highlight down here is your export button. What you can do by selecting this, Guardian will save this back to its source. And So this is a great way as you go, wherever you're pulling these families from, you're putting them right back into that location cleaned. I'm going to deselect this because I don't want to save it as we go. I'm going to go ahead and process. And as you'll see here, it will not take a long time to go through this, even with all the shared parameters that we have cleaning up. I think this is a good opportunity to pause for a brief moment to see if there's any questions about this given process.
Chris, I'll just chime in really quick because there's a question. In fact, this is a good example. In this progress bar, you could see Guardian going into the nested families within some of those families. And it's doing the work needed to swap parameters and anything else that Chris mapped. And it reloads everything on up, even into the project. So no need to like kind of break everything apart, have Guardian clean everything and do that reassembly yourself. It does it for you.
That's a really important fact here is Guardian is cleaning every nook and cranny of every nested family in there. Coming back to the shared parameters, as you're aware, when it comes to nested families, you may have the parameters and the shared parameters linked, and there might be included in formulas. Guardian will actually go through and update those shared parameters wherever they may exist, even in if they're linked or even if they're included in formulas. It will also retain all those values that are assigned to those parameters. So it really does keep everything intact. I think I saw a hand raised as we just now.
Yeah, this is Jerry. I have a question on the previous dialog box for the mapping.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a way to export that data so that a team can analyze it? Because a lot of times there's families where you just don't know enough to go through and do the mapping at the time when you're looking at it. It needs to be thought out and then addressed later.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'm going to let the Parley answer about sort of the data aspect of this. What I would like to highlight here is this is where I really talk about punning. If you don't understand the standard or the property at that moment in time, this is where I may, and let's just say, I'm just going to rename one of these, right? This is to kind of demonstrate this is what you would have done in that previous dialog on the import. I'd just put like TBD as a prefix. And then after the fact, after we get everything in there, then I can come up here to search and put TBD. And then I would be able to see everything. Unless I did something. Must have mapped that or changed the name incorrectly, right? Oh, I haven't mapped it yet. That's the reason why. But this would give you an opportunity to kind of see all those things that you don't know quite what it is, but then kind of go through and you can do your scan for usage here and find out where it is.
Well,
and whatnot.
My point here is that we need to go back and review those TBDs. And if they're stuck in a dialog box, it's harder for a team to review them offline. Is there a way that a team could review it through like an Excel spreadsheet or some external manner?
Definitely.
I'll chime in there, Chris. Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Good question. I'm actually glad you asked that because we do have a little known ability we added to this not too long ago. There's a little export button down there above that scan selection for usage. Yeah, mouse over that there, Chris. So what happens is when you scan properties for usages, of course, it populates the interface with these ones and however many times a property is used and the duplicates. But really everything's interrelated, right? A pattern can be used by a material, but that material can also be used by a wall type. And so when you click that export button, it's actually going to give you an XML file, which has those dependencies kind of built into it. So you could basically, like you're asking, Jerry, send that to a team and they could review this.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Parley.
There's another question from Dave here, just wanting to confirm that when you export or fix and clean a family, and you say save families out, right, Chris? This basically is going to drop those families into a zip file for you to kind of put back where they belong. The problem with Revit is a lot of times the families don't have their saved paths really accurately placed in them. And so we're kind of leaving that up to you.
Yeah.
But Guardian is smart enough to know what families indeed had some effectual change made to them.
And I saw that, I don't know if it was the same Dave had just raised their hand, or if there's a follow-up question.
Yeah, basically just a follow up on it. I thought I heard you say when you picked on that export button that it makes those changes back to the original family that you had loaded in, so you don't need to export them back out again. That's where I was getting a little confused on.
I see. It does make the changes within the project file we have opened, but not to the directory of files where they might have been loaded from.
Got it. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for clarifying, Parley. I'm going to go ahead and close this without saving, and I'm going to come back over to the PowerPoint. So step 5 is creating a content container. I would recommend having a single Revit project in which all of your families go into, and that this becomes your source of truth moving forward. I want to say I have a couple former teammates here who have utilized this methodology under my direction for many years. Is what we found that with thousands and thousands of families, a couple thousand details, all within drafting views, we found that this file was very stable. We hosted this on ACC, so everyone had access to it from wherever. Even though the file size was about 750 megs, which sounds large, what we found is that because it wasn't an active day-to-day project, there wasn't changings happening on a regular basis, it actually performed really well. And never mind that we kept, this model absolutely clean all the time. So using Guardian to make sure that there wasn't anything foreign in here, it was just what was necessary was in here. So the model performed really well. A couple other things that sort of a housekeeping sort of perspective on this is because we hosted on ACC, we made sure that we had set regular publishing schedules on this. So we always had backups of this. My recommendation actually before we got to ACC, we actually hosted this on OneDrive or SharePoint, kind of one and the same, because OneDrive will make a backup of all this. Every time the files change, there's a backup. I'm going to say never once did we actually have to go to this backups, but just for a peace of mind, making sure that you're thinking long term, just in case something happens. Really, the ultimate goal of having a content container is one, so you can see everything kind of laid out. One of the things that we would always do, say the casework here, is making sure that our subcategories are aligned. Each view, say take this 3D view for casework, we had a custom view template in which every subcategory we assigned a color. So we were able to just visually quickly identify if a subcategory was misaligned. In addition, by getting it all in one place, we were able to start to look at those TBDs, right? And start to understand is, in the say casework, someone would call the cabinet itself, the subcategory, say, in half the families, they would say it's called cabinet. In the other half, they would call it carcass. And so you get to the end, you're like, all right, which one are we going to choose? Or maybe when you're cleaning up your details, it might be a textile or dimension style. And you start seeing these side by side, it gives you an opportunity to kind of see it holistically. But because the power of Guardian here is you just say, all right, now, all the carcasses, I want it to be cabinet. You click the button and Guardian will process it, done. And then whenever Guardian sees this in the future, whether it's your container or every subsequent project in your entire firm, it will automatically be updated to cabinet. So, when you just think about when someone is doing their interior elevations, that they set their view templates and set their subcategory for cabinet to a certain way, they know that their view will respond exactly how you anticipate it. The graphical representation of that casework would be exactly how you intended. So the other thing is this is a great place for your detail items and your drafting views. So if you're managing very large sets of just standard details, and you're utilizing detail items, as you're aware, if you insert a view from another project that has detail items on it, Revit's going to want to put the 1s, 2s, and 3s behind it, right? So Guardian gives you an opportunity to map all those, clean all those up, just so you have a single break line. And I would even add one thing here is when it comes to the break lines, Guardian is smart enough to know, say this incoming family has the extent of the break line using instance parameters to be this. Many of you may have gone through this process where once you've inserted that and you swap the family out, just manually within Revit or maybe another tool, is that it will resort back to some other extents. With Guardian, we actually keep those values, we memorize those values and replace them. So when you do a holistic swap of an instance with a detail item with an instance value on it, Guardian will remember those values and place it after swapping. So this becomes really a great place of really maintaining all of your content, maintaining your standards. And again, this becomes your source of truth. So I see a hand is raised.
Hey, Chris. I just wanted to bring up a question that was in the chat from Anne, asking if is a container model for each discipline recommended?
I would say yes, but I would say start with one. At some point, well, it depends on how much content you're talking about. I can make the argument for both directions here. I would say, keeping it on one, because simple things like your shared parameters and keeping that online, just so that, let's just say if you're using a width, right? You're using that same width across all of your content, regardless of discipline. However, the reason I would argue to actually separate out into separate ones is basically because sometimes you may have different teams working on that, and they are operating maybe on slightly different standards. And just strictly from my own experience working in a multidisciplinary firm, we were never able to get the, say, architecture and the MEP and the structure standards perfectly in alignment across. And so sometimes you'd need a little division there. And so I saw that Joe Wages raised his hand on this. And I know Joe may have a comment or two on this front.
Yes, former battles. But the question I had was this: if I have say like I've got a standard template, everything's good, all my share parameters are good, I've stripped out all my content, I've made my single sole source of truth. I'm now pumping at families. Are you saying to do it in groups of 50, map everything, and then do the next batch, or like how am I doing that?
Yeah, exactly. So again, start with your sort of those base families. Just do a handful of those, do your mappings. Then depending on, again, the size of the family, if it's something like under a meg or something, you might be able to get up to 100 at a time. Drop it in, do your mappings. Then once that's done, go grab another 100, drop it in. You'll find the sort of the right amount. Another thing is, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, yeah, the follow up was, sorry about that. If I'm using like a Python script and I'm harvesting, like, say I've got like a batch of like rogue templates from everywhere, and I'm harvesting everything just carte blanche, right? And I'm Python scripting it, I'm dumping it in a location. Is that a good approach to do that, to capture all that stuff? Do you think that would be the best way to get everything? That way I've covered all bases?
The only thing with using a Python script and kind of scripting this, kind of bringing everything in, is and partly you may have maybe a better perspective on this than I do, is this, I guess, the order of sequence or order of operations in which this is happening. Is you want to kind of get it in a single location, but then how all that handles, does it pull from one location and dump it in, then immediately go to the next, and how does Guardian react with that versus kind of figure it all out, then bring it all in at once. It might be one of those things where you may not process the content as it comes in, but wait until it's all in and then process it holistically through the project properties dialog. Guardian, or excuse me, Party, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think that covers it. Thanks.
Yep. Cool.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you, buddy.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And step 6 there is exporting your content. So this is, I'm going to say, probably the easiest step of the whole process, whether just exporting it to your content management solution or even a folder. And there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of tools out there for sort of mass exporting. You can do this as you're bringing things in. I do recommend waiting until the end to do this for 2 reasons. One is getting back to those TBDs, right? Now everything has been cleaned up after the fact and everything's in alignment. And 2 is, many of you may know the secret, is when you save a family directly out of Revit versus saving it from the family editor, it reduces its file size. So it's something, a little upside to that. And also, once you're done, send all these graphical standards up to the Guardian cloud using Guardian Sync. Before we close out here, I just kind of want to go over the process we went with Ratio almost 2 years ago. So we're going to drop a link to that case study and that webinar then, so you can see this. We spent about 40 hours cleaning up Ratio's library. And when I say we say a lot of it was the Guardian team having to learn Ratio's standards as part of this process. So we cleaned up just shy of 4,000, or I would just say 307 or 3,741 of their approved libraries or approved families. But then there was another 4,470 of non-approved families. So they had a lot of furniture families from tons of manufacturers, a bunch of random stuff. We said, let's just dump it in. Let's just dump it into to the family cleanup tool, just so we can teach Guardian. So when I said furniture families, we had all the Hayworth and on and on. We've all been there. We've all seen it. This gave us an opportunity to kind of learn those manufacturer standards and how to teach Guardian to convert those into Ratio standards. As you can see, of those families, there was over 600 individual detail items with over 744 types. Because when you're mapping detail items, you also want to map the family types. So, and we also just shy of 300 drafting views that we cleaned up. And so we touched, and we were able to see this in the data. I'm going to show you the dashboard here in a second, is we were able to touch and clean up almost 57,000 items, individual elements, all within about 40 hours. And so when we look at the total properties mapped, right? So what we did, while a lot of properties are mapped, as you can see that number on the left, just say your object styles and subcategories. We mapped over 1,000 of them, but then we removed so much more, right? So when you think about the items that were removed, whether it's your CAD imports or your materials, that's just making those families lighter. It's making your projects lighter. It's also removing those foreign standards from your projects, right? So that means your overall quality of your documentation is improved. And one of the things that we did as part of this process is we made sure that we're using Guardian Backstage to capture all that data. I think this is a really important step in all of this, is making sure that you're capturing and understanding how much Guardian is working here for you, because at some point 40 hours in the scheme of things is not a lot, but I imagine for a lot of you going to your leadership and say, hey, can I get 40 hours to go clean our library? They're going to be like, why? What's the value of that? So having Guardian and especially Guardian Backstage to provide you this data to show, hey, this is how much we've cleaned. This is how much we taught Guardian. And then every subsequent project that we do in this firm moving forward will take advantage of these automations. So ultimately, this whole process is about improving your graphical quality throughout all of your projects, right? So this is really about your project deliverables and what you do as a firm. It really starts with your basic families and making sure they're absolutely in alignment. So I want to thank everyone for their time today. And I know we're right on 5 o'clock, and I want to just make sure we answer any last questions people may have.
I think from the chat, Chris, we are covered.
All right, awesome. I appreciate everyone's time today. I will say personally, having done tens of thousands of families with this process, it is one of the most satisfying things you'll ever do, knowing that, one, you just feel like you're cleaning everything, and just the peace of mind knowing that your library is perfect when you deliver it to your teams. So that being said, I just want to thank everyone for their time today.